Click the bell icon to get latest videos from Ekeeda.
Hello friends, we'll be discussing certain details about what do you mean by source documents for accounting, what are they actually meant and how are they prepared. Let's figure out in the next video. So when we speak about source document basically refers to certain examples that we do on day-to-day basis. Supposingly, you go in some shopping mart and you purchase certain items, the invoice that you get is the source document. That means that's the document that gives out any kind of evidence about the transaction. Let's take an ATM withdrawal slip. That also is a source document which gives out that there has been an evidence which refers to the specific transaction of withdrawal or any kind of thing that you have done with regards to your bank accounts. Similarly, when you go to any kind of shopping mart, you purchase certain items, you get a specific invoice with you that can be useful for you in case if there is any kind of defect which you can provide back to the vendor or provide back to the business that you have procured the goods from. And this specific invoice will help you in evidencing or providing or any kind of evidence that is supposed to be provided to prove that this transaction took place in the first instance. So when you talk about source document, this is what it's all about. Let's consider an example. You have cleared your specifications in 10th and you were promised that once you achieve any kind of specific percentage that was supposed to be promised or that has been promised to you or that has been promised by you, and you were supposed to be given a specific gift for that, maybe a computer. So once you have achieved that specific percentage and in your boards you have cleared that thing out, now the next one is to fulfill the specific promise. So your dad took you to the specific computer shop and you got that computer or you got that laptop of your choice. Now when you made that specific purchase, there was a cash transaction, there might be a credit transaction. So you get an invoice slip for that specific transaction. Now that specific invoice slip is nothing but a source document or a document that provides an evidence that this specific transaction of procuring that computer or laptop took place in the first instance. So that is all about source document. Let's jot down certain points. We have mentioned certain points here. We'll note down for you and we'll go ahead with getting more clarity on source documents. Let's figure that out. Now, transaction in two parties basically involves a kind of exchange of two things. Now, whenever there is a transaction that happens between two parties, exactly a transaction will happen between two or more parties. So we'll just take two parties for example. Now party A and party B, there is a transaction between both of them whereby party A procures certain goods from party B and party B is supposed to receive certain amount from party A. So when party A, that means Mr. A and Mr. B, let's take Mr. A and Mr. B. Mr. A is supposed to procure certain goods from Mr. B and Mr. B in return is supposed to receive certain cash from him. Now this specific transaction involves two specific things. First, that is payment. That means Mr. A will pay Mr. B for the products that has purchased or that he has procured. And the second option is procurement. So these two things are really important when you talk about any transaction. Any transaction that comes into place, Mr. A and B, or that happens between Mr. A and B, involves these two things. First is payment and the second is procurement. It can be vice versa also. It can be procurement first and then payment afterwards. So whichever the case may be, but these two things or these two are the most important things when we talk about exchange between any transaction. So when we talk about any kind of transaction that is taking place or there is a specific exchange happening between A party and B party or a first party and the second party, then when we talk about any kind of exchange, this is what we talk about. So these specific transactions that we deal with between two or more parties, there is certain give and take relationship that we have. So every transaction will have a give and take relationship. Some party will give out, some party will take it. Now, when the party takes it, he has to give something in return. That might be cash, that might be something in kind also. So, nevertheless, when we talk about any kind of exchange in the transaction, there arises a need of source document. When we talk about source document, we ideally talk about what do we have in common there. The two things that are common is payment and procurement. And after that, the third thing that arises out of these two results, or the result of these two activities, refers to the source document. So when you go for any kind of shopping, any kind of procurement, any kind of goods purchase, any kind of clothing, or any kind of asset purchase, you get an invoice for the purchase that you have done. That purchase or that invoice is given to you because you have made a specific payment towards it. You have shelled out certain money, and that's the reason you receive specifically that specific invoice. Now when you talk about that specific invoice, that basically refers to a specific source document which is required to prove the evidence of any transaction that has taken place. Hence, when we talk about source document, we also talk about the give and take relationship here. Let's go on to the next sheet and understand what more details have been mentioned about source document. Now, when we talk about business transactions, any business transaction that we have to go through or that we deal with is certainly evidenced by a source document. That means a document which proves that there has been a transaction of this place that took in the first instance. That means this specific transaction happened, and you can prove that specific transaction happened, or you can prove the happening of that specific transaction due to the specific source document. Had it been that there was no specific source document that was provided to you in the first place, you wouldn't have been able to prove that this specific transaction took place in the first instance. So when you talk about any kind of transaction, a supporting copy is required to handle or to probably ensure that all these transactions that have taken place are a part of any kind of transaction or has a source document which can evidence these transactions. Let's go on to the next point. Now, the examples of such documents may be cash memo, invoice, salary slip, pay-in slip, or any kind of slip that is provided related to that specific transaction. Now, all these slips that are provided, they give out the details of what kind of transaction it was, what was the nature of the transaction, who are the parties who were the part of the specific transaction, what is the amount, what is the date, what are the details specifically related to that transaction. So when you talk about specifications, you also talk about these minor details in it. So let's take for an example, you went and you purchased a laptop. Now that specific invoice that will be given to you will include the model of the laptop, the amount of the laptop, the quantity that you have purchased, any other accessories that you have purchased, what was the date when this specific transaction was happened, to whom the amount was paid, who is the buyer, that means the invoice is generated on whose name, who is the supplier, that means the name of the seller, and the voucher number or probably the serial code of that specific invoice. It is also important to note down that there is a serial code for every specific invoice that is generated. Why? Is because that gives a track hold to any specific company to record and to further analyze if in case there is any defect or in case if there is any kind of goods that are being returned to the supplier, so they can match according to the invoice number and see whether what is defect or whether there has been defect in any kind of the goods that has been procured by the purchaser. So all these details, these are the minor details I'm clarifying. However, there might be different details, and that is as per the need and the nature of the specific business that the person is dealing with. So these are the basic things that you need to check when you talk about any kind of invoice. Let's figure out few more details on this part. Now, when a specific document that gives out that this is the evidence of the transaction that took place, that document is called as a source document, and the other name for it is voucher. So when you talk about any kind of source document or a voucher, that specifically proves that an event where the specific purchase or sale transaction took place, or any kind of transaction took place, it may be a kind of any nature. So any nature of the transaction, whether it took place or not, that specific evidence is provided by the source document, or we can call it as voucher. So voucher is nothing but it is equivalent to a source document, or it is the source document itself which gives out the details, that means the evidence or probably the happening of that specific transaction. In case if this specific voucher or its specific invoice or source document is not available with you, there cannot be any reason for the supplier to deny the fact that there has been no such transaction that has taken place. Because in case if you have lost this voucher, or if there was no voucher given to you, then in such case the transaction didn't take place at all. This is something that we can assume, or that any specific party will assume here. So when you talk about any kind of source document or any kind of evidence that has to be proven, there has to be a specific invoice, there has to be a specific voucher related to it. Let's go on to the third point. Now, all these source documents are further arranged chronologically, they are kept in a separate file, and they all have a unique code. So they have a specific code. That means, as I've told you earlier, every invoice has a specific invoice number. That invoice number gives the detail of that specific bill and that specific bill only. Hence it is called as a unique invoice code. Now after you have a unique invoice code, you need to arrange that thing in a specific order. That means a chronological order, and you have to keep it in a separate file. Let's say for a month, if you have purchase transactions, you will record all the purchase transactions in a separate file, arranged in a chronological order. That means as per the date or as per the invoice number, whichever it may be. If you have invoice numbers lined up like invoice number 1, 2, 3, you have to arrange that in a chronological order. And if you're giving it, of course, if you're giving it on the specific date, that means on 1st of August you gave certain invoices, like 10 invoices to 10 customers, and after that on 2nd of August you have another 10 customers. That means you have total 20 vouchers. So all these vouchers will be arranged in a specific date. Now the arrangement will depend on the kind of invoice number that you have, and also will help you in defining which date this specific invoice number was generated. So when we talk about recording these transactions or recording these vouchers, we have to arrange them in a separate file in a chronological order, and it has a unique code. So these are the details that you need to ensure, or you need to know about a voucher or a source document. Let's go ahead and further understand the certain illustrations that I'm trying to give you, and you have to poach down or further get ahead with whether these transactions are related to any kind of invoice or will have any kind of invoice generated for it. I'll give down certain examples for you. Note down those examples, and further we'll discuss whether each of these transactions will have a voucher generated or not. Let's go ahead. Now we have given you an example whereby we have to further state whether there is any evidence of the transaction or not. So the example states that Mr. A purchased a house from Mr. B for rupees 15 lakhs. Now this specific transaction was drafted and duly signed under a specific sale agreement. Now when we have a sale agreement, this further was actually gazetted or validated by a gazetted officer. Now when we talk about duly validated or duly signed and duly validated by a gazetted officer, we need to further check whether this specific transaction has a specific documentation, or whether any documentation can prove this specific transaction or not. What do you think would be the answer? Correct. The answer is yes. There is an evidence to this specific transaction, and the evidence itself is the sale agreement. Now, when you talk about any kind of transaction that is happening, the sale agreement refers to the evidence or the source document which proves that there has been a transaction between Mr. A and Mr. B, where Mr. A purchased a house from Mr. B for rupees 15 lakhs, and this specific agreement was signed under the categorization of a sale agreement and was duly submitted to the gazetted officer for validation. Now this specific transaction has a specific source document which is known as a sales agreement. Now when this sales agreement is further given to any kind of person which will have a good title. Now when Mr. B gives out this specific transaction or gives out a signed document to Mr. A stating that I have sold this house to him, and now that he is a good owner, or probably he owns a good title on this specific land or property. So Mr. A becomes the duly owner or duly signed and verified owner of the specific house, and no one can challenge this specific transaction because this specific transaction has enough of proof or any kind of subordinate documents that are required or supporting documents that are required to prove that owner of the house is Mr. A and no one else. So when we talk about evidence, these specific transactions clearly state out that there is an evidence here which can prove that the transaction took place in the first instance. Let's go on to the second illustration and we'll figure out whether we have any kind of evidence there or not. Let's go to the next one. Now the second example states that Mr. B purchased certain candles from a stationery shop and he wasn't provided with the bill. That means he never asked for the bill of those specific purchase transaction. He went home and he checked that the box of candle has certain defective candles in it. Now, can he prove that the transaction took place and that the owner of the shop is supposed to refund the amount back? or get the defective candles replaced. What do you think? Is there any kind of proof that he can provide and make the shopkeeper or the owner of the stationery shop go ahead and refund the amount or replace the defective candles? What do you think about it? Correct, there is no proof. The reason being, when Mr. B purchased those candles from the stationery shop, he should have asked for the bill. He didn't, and hence there was no specific evidence that this transaction ever took place between the shopkeeper or the owner of the shop and between Mr. B. Had it been there was any kind of invoice or a sales copy or probably a specific bill which we can call as a voucher itself, and if there was any kind of such document available with him, he would have easily proved that the transaction took place, and he could have further marched to the shopkeeper or to the owner of the shop asking for a refund, or he could have asked for a replacement of those defective candles. But now in this situation, there is no proof that the transaction took place within the shopkeeper and the owner, or probably the owner and the specific purchaser, that means Mr. B. Hence, when we talk about any kind of source document, these kind of transactions help us evaluate whether there is any kind of evidence that can be provided to prove that the transaction happened in the first place or not. And if the transaction happened in the first place can be proved by these kind of evidence, we can further take any actions when it comes to defective goods being replaced, or if there is any kind of refund which you have to claim further. For example, you can take a kind of insurance company. So if you have given all the details to the insurance company, and if there is any kind of death or any kind of claim that you have to make in terms of death or any kind of accident policy, and if you have all the evidence whether this specific transaction or the policy was taken in good faith, and there are bills which can be provided whereby the medical expenses has been covered under it, hence you can go ahead and make the claim. But if there is no evidence or there is no proof or there is no document providing stating that the medical expenses has taken place, in such a situation you won't be able to prove it. Hence, when we talk about any kind of example or any kind of details about any kind of transaction being related to a source document, you have to check for all these details. Let's go for the last example and you'll have better clarity on this. Now, the last transaction refers to, or the last example refers to, an insurance company where an insurance company declined the claim of Mr. A, stating that the claim cannot be passed for Mr. A as the car isn't in the name of Mr. A. Now, facts of the case refer to that Mr. A purchased a second-hand car, but the transfer activities were never completed. That means he just took the car, he made the payment. However, there was no sale agreement, there was no transaction which can refer, or there was no agreement, or probably there was no kind of source document that can prove that this specific car now belongs to Mr. A, because Mr. A never bothered to complete the transfer activities. Mr. A never bothered to complete the transfer activities of the insurance or to provide a specific sale agreement. So in such cases, yes, the insurance company has the right to decline the claim, as the specific claim refers to a specific previous owner, and until and unless the previous owner goes ahead and makes the claim, this specific transaction cannot be passed. Hence, when we talk about any such transaction, we need to have source document which can prove that this specific transaction took place. So I hope all these three examples give you better clarity about how a specific transaction is supposed to be done, or how a source document or a voucher is really important when you have to further go ahead while making claims or making any kind of decisions on it. So this is what we had to discuss about source document, their meanings, their content and specimen. So thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned with Ekeeda and keep subscribing to Ekeeda.